Today, we're going to be talking about motivation. First thing I want you to do is just pause the video for a second and write 5 things you are thankful for. Then, when we discuss in class, we're going to analyze these and discuss these. So, motivation. Psychologists see motivation as being an important part of human nature. So, motivation connects observable behavior to internal states. Right? So, we've talked about before how we don't exactly know what's going on inside our brain, but motivation helps connect those two things, right? Because if you do something, usually there's a motivation behind your action. Motivation accounts for variability in behavior. So, why two people growing up in the same neighborhood, one becomes successful and the other doesn't, right? A lot of times we look at, well, what was the motivation for the person who became successful and the one for the person who didn't? Motivation creates perseverance despite adversity. Same situation. So, how can, when you're in an adverse situation, and obviously there's a variety, numerous that you could be in, what allows you to persevere through those tough times, right? So, there's usually some type of motivation that gets you to push through that. And then lastly, motives relate biology to behavior. And we'll talk about some theories with that one. So, a couple vocab words to know. Drive. Drive is a biologically instigated motivation. A state of tension is created which humans will seek to correct. Right? So an example of this would be drinking water. So the key word here for drive is biological. Right? So drive is biological. Where motive is motivational process that is learned. So like an achievement, like you reach an achievement with sports, at school, at work, something like that. So that's a motive to do something. So that's something that's learned. It's not natural. All right, so that's key. So motive is learned, where drive is biological. So while some motivated behaviors clearly fall into one of these two categories, many actually have roots in both biology and cognition and learning. So it's hard to, so most things is usually a little combination of both. Extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation. So we've talked about this a little before. So extrinsic motivation, a desire to perform a behavior because of a promised reward or threats of punishment. Intrinsic motivation, a desire to perform a behavior for its own sake and to be effective. So at extrinsic motivation, there's outside motivation for you doing what you're doing. Even if, like let's say you study hard to get that A. Well, that's extrinsic motivation because you're studying to get that A. Where a great example is like reading books. If you read a book just because you want to read a book, that's intrinsic motivation. Right? You're doing it because you want to do it. If you're doing it because you have to for a class, that's extrinsic motivation. All right, so think of some examples of both that we can discuss, and then I'll go into further examples as we discuss. So which type of motivation is better? Which do you think produces more positive results? So research indicates that intrinsic motivation has an edge over extrinsic motivation in most cases. This does not mean that extrinsic motivation isn't good or does not work. In many cases, the two actually work together. So a lot of times, the two work together, kind of like with me teaching, right? So, I love helping people. That's why I became a teacher. So there's a lot of intrinsic motivation. I've done a lot of things, especially like early on in my teaching career where I volunteered coaching. I'd stay after with students, different things like that. I wasn't getting paid for that. It was intrinsic. But at the same time, if I wasn't getting paid, I couldn't be a teacher, right? I have to support my family. So the money is definitely an extrinsic motivation for me, right? So both are actually working together. So usually intrinsic, and we'll discuss this a little bit more, has a slight edge over extrinsic because if you do it because you want to do it, um, people tend to be a little bit more motivated. And extrinsic, if you take that extrinsic motivation away, then a lot of times people stop doing whatever it is they're doing. So another example of how the two blend together is at the bottom here, where let's say journalism students who wash cars as a fundraiser all spring and summer to pay for their trip to the National Convention in St. Louis in the fall are working to make money. That's extrinsic motivation, right? The money. But their desire to go to the convention is intrinsic. Right? So a lot of times things they blend and they work together. So what's some problems with extrinsic motivation? This is what I was kind of alluding to earlier. A primary concern about external rewards, however, is that behaviors maintained by extrinsic motivation alone may not be enough to be effectively sustained once the motivation is gone. So an example of this, will students' grades go down if their parents stop giving them money for earning A's and B's? So some students might get money for getting good grades. Never happened to me. I knew people it happened to. Always wish it, happened to me. But I have had students in the past saying they used to get paid for grades, and once their parents stopped paying them, their grades went way down. Right? And so that's one of the problems we talked about when you remove that extrinsic motivation. Are you still motivated to do something? Even when maybe you were initially motivated, like you would have done it on your own without the money. So an example is like think about professional athletes. Most of them grew up just loving the game, whatever game it is they play, whether it's football, basketball, baseball, hockey, soccer, whatever it might be. But once they start getting paid, now you give that extrinsic motivation in there. And a lot of times people sit out. People sit out whole seasons because they were only going to get paid 10 million instead of 12 million, right? So a lot of times, when the extrinsic motivation takes away, even when there was intrinsic motivation to start with, that's kind of gone away. So evidence suggests that the removal of an extrinsic motivation will result in behavior levels lower than before the rewards were given. Over justification. So that's a vocab word to know. And I guess this is the example I was just giving, right? The over-justification effect is the idea that if we give extrinsic rewards or motivators for things that people already love to do and would do without a reinforcer, eventually the person's intrinsic motivation will be replaced by that extrinsic motivation. So an example would be like professional athletes and musicians who started off naturally loving what they do, but then money got involved and then they started doing it for the money and not because of intrinsic. And like I said, this happens for grades, and I'm sure most things because you get used to that extrinsic reward, and then you expect it all the time. Kind of an example, but this kind of goes with abnormal behavior. Example I usually use for that unit is I was at a conference one time and a psychologist was talking about what happens if you give like a student or your child M&Ms or Skittles every day, and then one day you don't give it to them, right? Obviously you don't need to give it to them, but then they're going to think that they're being like abused because you didn't give them an M&M that one day because they're so used to it. So the point is that you just get used to extrinsic, motivators with things. So here's just a little cartoon. It says, "Remember, kid, it's not whether you win or lose, but how much they pay you for the game." So obviously that guy's talking about, extrinsic motivation. It's all about the money. If anyone's ever seen Jerry Maguire, it's all about showing you the money. All right, so let's talk about a couple theories. So one theory is instinct theory. The theory that all behaviors will be determined by innate factors and biologically based behaviors that generally lead to survival. So the term instinct has become overused. So the psychologists changed the phrase that they use to fixed action patterns. So like birds migrating, salmon returning to the creeks to spawn. So instinct, that's the thing you're naturally born with, but it's been kind of overused a little bit. And so they've kind of changed it, and now they usually call it fixed action patterns. So remember, innate means like you're born with those factors. So it's natural. It's things you naturally do. Like birds, how do they know to migrate? They just know. Salmon return to the same creek that they were born in. So why do you think this theory became outdated? And does this theory really explain behavior? So think about that, as some possible discussions for class. The next theory is the drive reduction theory. The idea that a physiological need creates a state of tension, which is a drive. Remember, we talked about drive earlier, which is motivating an organism to satisfy their needs. So drive reduction theory states that a person will eat food as a result of drive of hunger, right? A state of tension that humans seek to correct. So this theory aims for homeostasis, which is another vocab word you should know that we'll talk about this unit, which is just a biological balance. So this one, if you think about it, just makes sense, right? You have some kind of need, right? You're thirsty, you're hungry, right? That creates a drive. So you have a need for food or water. That creates a drive, which is hunger or thirst. Therefore, you're going to do something to satisfy that drive, right? You're going to eat food or you're going to drink water. All right, two other theories. We have the cognitive social learning theory, which says our behavior is determined by two factors. Number one, the expectation of attaining a goal. And number two, the personal value of the goal. And so this is locus of control, which is our belief that we control the outcome of our own lives, either intrinsic or extrinsic. So this was created by Julian Ryder. I actually have a locus control test that we can take. It can be used for motivation, and it's also kind of a personality test as well. And so pretty much, you get your results, and you tend to be either intrinsic or extrinsic locus of control, which means like intrinsic means whatever happens to you, you feel like you're responsible for it. Extrinsic locus of control means you felt like it was outside forces that resulted in the behaviors that happen. Like, so if you things just kind of like were left up to fate. Oh, it was bound to happen no matter what. Where intrinsic, they take responsibility for what happens, even though someone else might have done something, but they'll say, well, I put myself in that situation. So usually when I do these like tests in class, most people tend to fall in the middle. And then we have psychodynamic theory. So remember psychodynamic, we've talked about, that's the Freudian, he's the father of psychoanalysis, psychodynamic theory. So this theory says our motivation comes from the deep, dark parts of our unconscious minds, the id. Right? So Freud, when we do the personality unit, he talks about the id, ego, and superego. So the id is the deep, dark, unconscious part of your mind. The part that doesn't care about consequences, it just cares about desires. So, he said in this theory that we have two basic needs: eros, which is the desire for sex, and thanatos, which is aggression and destruction. So, if anyone's seen Avengers, Thanatos, he's the one that destroyed, half the galaxies or world or whatever it was, right? So, the key thing with Freud, and there's a lot of criticisms of Freud, but when he came up with these theories, he was trying to explain mental disorders, not everyday behaviors. So we look at this and it looks a little crazy, and it is if you're talking about everyday healthy people. He was only looking at people with mental disorders and trying to explain why they had mental disorders. So you have to keep that in mind when you look at that theory. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So he's a humanistic perspective. Remember the different approaches, perspectives. This is the humanistic perspective. So this is one some of you guys have probably heard of before. So that's a good thing. So hopefully you have a little background on this, but this is something you definitely want to know. So Maslow argued that humans behave to satisfy specific types of needs. So he broke them into 5 categories in the pyramid. So number 1, that's actually at the bottom of the pyramid. That's your most basic need. And then it goes up from there. So at the bottom of the pyramid, you have your biological needs. This is your hunger, your thirst, your warmth. Next, you have your safety needs, right? So usually we try to avoid danger. Number 3, we have attachment, wanting to belong to something. Number 4, we have esteem, seeing oneself as competent and effective. And then 5, self-actualization, being all that you can possibly be, right? So that's being like your best person. So Maslow said that there's a natural hierarchy or rank to the needs. So before one of the higher needs can be fulfilled, the needs on the levels below must be met, at least to some degree. Right? So most needs are met at a rate of about 85% before a person can move to a higher need. So think about so the bottom one's biological. The one right above that is safety. Well, if you're starving, you're not going to care about your safety. You're going to put yourself in danger to get food, right? So, what he's saying is that the needs below must be met at least to a certain degree, and they say around 85% before you worry about the next one. So here's another chart, and there's a few, and there's some different charts out there. But here's another one. So at the bottom is biological or physiological, same thing. So we're talking about breathing, food, water, sex, sleep, homeostasis, remember that's the biological balance, excretion, right? So these are all basic needs, right? So a lot of people are like, oh, why is sex on there? Well, you kind of have to have it to reproduce to keep your species alive, like all animals. There was a religion who didn't believe in sex at all, um, and they're not around anymore because they never reproduced. They thought people would just keep joining them, and they didn't, and they died out. The second one, we got safety. So this is, security of body, security of employment, security of resources, of morality, of the family, of health, of property. The third one, love and belonging. So we're talking about, you want to belong to something. You have friends, you have family, uh, you know, relationships. The fourth one is esteem. So self-esteem, confidence, achievement, respect of others, respect by others. And the last one, the top of the pyramid, this is self-actualization. Uh, this people who are up here, they tend to be very moral, they tend to be creative, spontaneous, they tend to be problem solvers, they lack prejudice, and they accept facts. So if you look at the news, you can kind of see some people that aren't really fitting at the top of the pyramid right now. Right, so you see a lot of prejudice going on. You see a lot of people that just don't accept facts. Right, you have this whole alternative facts that has been going around for years now. So now what I want you to do is organize the 5 things you are thankful for. All right, the things you wrote at the beginning of the notes. So you wrote down into the appropriate part of Maslow's hierarchy. So like you can just kind of put it even in your notes, like where do they belong in the Maslow's hierarchy? All right, so take a little bit and then we will discuss that. So here is a modern day Maslow's hierarchy. And so at the bottom, you got your physiological needs. You got your Wi-Fi, the computer, battery. Safety needs, obviously, maybe Google Maps to get you where you need to go. You got your security on your phones and your computers. Love and belonging. You have, you got the WhatsApp, Skype, Facebook, and now we can add Zoom to that, right? Everyone in 2020 learned what Zoom is. Then you have your esteem needs, which this is going to lead to when we talk about abnormal behavior, social media and the effects of our esteem needs. But you got your Twitter and Instagram, Snapchat, and then self-actualization. You have your Pinterest, what is that, YouTube, LinkedIn, and now after the pandemic, I've seen a lot of other ones of these as well. Um, so just think about being on lockdown, how your hierarchy of needs have changed. So think about that, right? And maybe even create a new one that we can discuss in class. So what are some new ones during a pandemic, during a lockdown, and how has that changed a little bit? All right, so the last slide. So criticism of Maslow. So in a lot of things, especially this semester, we're going to talk about a lot of criticism. We have all these different theories, but they're not perfect. So although critics will admit Maslow's hierarchy was the first real step towards a comprehensive theory of motivation, they say it isn't complete. People often neglect their basic biological needs for more social needs. All right, so they do things because of peer pressure, even though it might put them in danger or other things. Cross-cultural needs. Individualistic versus collectivist cultures see needs differently. And so this is a criticism of most theories, because most of these theories are Western theories based on individualistic countries like the United States. Well, in different countries and different cultures, like collectivist cultures, their needs might be different. And then the next one, sensation seeking. Why would someone jump out of a perfectly good airplane for fun? So you have these adventure junkies, these adrenaline junkies, who put themselves in danger, just for the thrill of it. So they bypass biological, right? Or they bypass safety just for fun. So, you're in a good airplane, let's just jump off for fun. Hey, let's jump off this bridge and go bungee jumping, right? So you have all these people that are safe but put themselves in danger on purpose. So, obviously there's a lot of criticism. So is there any other areas that, this doesn't explain? So think about this. Do you have any criticisms of Maslow? So be ready to discuss some of those. One common one is a lot of people would switch the esteem and the belonging. A lot of people say they need to have good self-esteem, and confidence before they can like belong to different groups and stuff like that. So that one's argued, and there's good arguments for both ways for that one.